Good morning, everyone. My name is Narusha Ridgewell, and I am the Events and Social Media Manager at CTEX, the Centre for Economic Transition Expertise at the London School of Economics and Political Science, better known as LSE. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Brazil's Investment-Led Growth in the Ecological Transition. Today's event is jointly convened by CTEX at LSE, the Institute for Climate and Society, and the Brazilian Centre for International Relations, SEBRI, with the support of our partners, World Climate Foundation and South of the Future. At today's event, we are delighted to welcome policymakers, academics, investors, development practitioners and representatives from civil society who have joined us during London Climate Action Week for the launch of this important new discussion paper. Before we begin, can I just cover a few housekeeping notes? Please ensure all of your mobile phones are turned to silent. You may know this already, but the event is being streamed online. Also, restrooms are just up there and then down the stairs to the left. I'm also pleased to share that the discussion paper being launched today, Brazil's Investment-Led Growth in the Ecological Transition, is now publicly available and can be downloaded from the CTEX website. So you can download it by scanning the QR code on the slide. We hope today's discussion will encourage further engagement with its findings and recommendations. We will now begin with opening remarks from representatives of the organising institutions. Our opening speakers will offer reflections from their respective institutional perspectives on why this discussion matters and why now is an important moment to be having it. It is now my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Rob Patalano, Executive Director of the Centre for Economic Transition Expertise at LSE. Welcome, Rob.
So welcome, distinguished guests, esteemed panelists, friends of Brazil, and those of you who are really interested to see how sustainability can take a new path forward in emerging markets. I want to thank two groups of collaborators today for making this provocative paper to bring it forward with stakeholder engagement, which is truly important to make sure that we get this right. So first, I want to thank Isabella Teixeira from SEBRI, and all of the staff at SEBRI who engaged with us in Rio and here, and also for Maria Neto from IX, who also has made this possible. Maria, thank you, and for your staff as well. And then as well, Ambassador Antonio Patriota for creating the excitement around new ways of thinking during the COP30, really not just about Brazil, but really innovative thinking about sustainability for the 21st century. And then, of course, thank you to the World Climate Foundation and South of the Future for supporting this convening here today. We very much appreciate it. And then next, I want to thank, the second round is to thank the authors themselves for this ambitious work. Really, it was ambitious over the past few months to bring together so much research and to layer on additional research and thinking to it, not only for Brazil, but for emerging markets. So I wish to express my gratitude on behalf of our center, for all of the authors. Luis Awazu Pereira da Silva, who's the lead author, and he's a visiting professor in practice at CTEX, and he also has had a distinguished career across the BIS, the Central Bank of Brazil, and the Finance Ministry. Jorge Abache, who is a professor of economics at the University of Brasilia and a senior fellow at IX. And then Rodrigo Lim is partner director at Agriocone, And then Fernanda Jimenez is Senior Research Lead at LSC CTEX. So let me give just 2 minutes of framing here for this session. It's part of an ongoing engagement process about Brazil's ecological transition and development strategy. And to this end, the discussion paper, which I know many of you haven't had a chance to read because it's just come up on the screen, but I would just encourage you even to skim the executive summary as we're having the discussion. It's really compelling. It really stimulates the debate about Brazil and internationally about how policymakers and engaged stakeholders from across policy and society can really think about how society views growth paradigms, competitive advantage, and industrial strategy. The paper emerged from a shared recognition that climate policy, economic development, and industrial transformation, and even investment promotion are increasingly becoming part of the same policy challenge and therefore needs an integrated policy response. So it challenges the notions that governments are competing in the sense of choosing between growth and climate transition. They're not. And instead, this paper argues eloquently that sustainable growth, if it's pursued strategically, should be based on harnessing the underlying and underutilized benefits of energy and ecological transitions. In that sense, the discussion paper weaves these concepts with the author's own frameworks for adaptive monetary and fiscal policy in a hothouse world to set pillars for a new sustainable growth paradigm. And in particular, they make a strong case that a country's natural and structural endowments can offer a new geography of comparative advantage by creating forward-leaning growth strategy that embeds the competitive benefits across domestic and international value chains. And I think we all appreciate that this is really timely because now more and more advanced economies and emerging market economies are trying to reduce their dependency on particular dependencies across the world with critical minerals, EV, and clean tech on China, and to provide a more robust value chain. Furthermore, I'm particularly heartened that the paper makes clear that fiscal strategy needs to be better focused on resource allocation and fiscal consolidation to drive the strategy forward, improving regulatory quality and legal predictability, reducing distortions in subsidies, better public and private coordination, and strengthening incentives. And this should also result in better investor confidence, but I think we all know that's hard to do in practice. It's hard to gain investor confidence for policies because those policies fluctuate or they're not coherent. So I think in this case, what's quite impressive is these policies are made very clear in the paper to show that if combined, you actually can get investor promotion strategy yielding results. So let me give you an example. I think for this, you see green budgeting foundation, leveraging limited public balance sheet, scaling up blended finance, and also even actions to reduce investment risks. And in particular, if you bring all of this together, you can actually create a Brazil roadmap for implementation. And better still, the framework for this paper, which is stylized for Brazil, actually has relevance for other emerging markets. They may have different comparative advantages and different circumstances and a different position within the value chain, but they can benefit from this framework to create a coherent strategy. So in sum, I very much hope that the paper inspires a really relevant policy discussion between policymakers and stakeholders in society to try and think differently about how to move forward with their path. And I have no doubt that the insights in the paper and the insights from the esteemed panelists and the participants today will help us move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Our next speaker is Maria Neto, Executive Director of ICS, the Institute for Climate and Society, one of Brazil's leading philanthropic organisations working on climate and sustainable development. Maria, welcome.
So first of all, thank you everyone who made it to here. Apparently there was some rain and problems to get here, but it's really nice to see a lot of friends here. This work, and I want to congratulate, as Rob, the authors of the paper, is something we actually planned, Luis, over some meeting, not even, 5 months ago. So I'm amazed that we were able to actually, jointly with LSC, make this happen in such a short time. Why now? This is a very important moment. Brazil has elections. We have geopolitical situation that is stressing more and more our nature resources, and a discussion about that. There is a window of opportunity, and I think this paper is trying to bring forward this discussion, how we value more our nature resources and how we combine opportunities relating to renewables, to the agriculture, to the restoration, to the possibility to link and enforce further our trade relationships and our global value chains and the opportunities that Brazil has not only within its own economy, but with also other economies to grow. This is an opportunity, and I think the paper does a very good job, and I will not give the numbers because I think the authors are going to give them, but it makes a very good job to make it tangible. The investments that can be leveraged, the jobs, the opportunities in terms of sectors. And in such a short time, we were able to put that together. But I think, as Rob was saying as well, more important is what are the ways and the roadmap that we need to put forward, both in terms of fiscal, financial, and also regulatory system that can scale important private investments that are needed for those things to be achieved. And I think that's a bit the first provocation we are going to have here that I hope will help a dialogue that is just starting today. This paper for us was an initial roadmap that we hope can even become other papers and furthermore detail on how we can move on each one of those topics. A lot of the partners here are actually working on these areas. And for ICS, the reason to support that is precisely because each one of those areas are things we are already trying to support in Brazil in a very pragmatic way. Again, I think there is a lot of innovation on how we are looking at potential fiscal window of opportunity, how we can bring the private sector together. As Rob said, it's easier said than done. But I think that's a bit for us what we have to start with this here. It's a policy paper, but more than just a dialogue paper. It's a paper that we hope is a proposition for thinking forward how we move Brazil with this window of opportunity. So nothing more to add. I would like to thank really the great collaboration we had with LSE. I think we'll have many more opportunities to further this work. And again, with the authors in Brazil, we are going to do still a lot of work. And I hope also the debate we are going to have after the presentation of the paper, as Rob said, is also a good opportunity to think about how this kind of dialogues, particularly on the global south, can become also an opportunity to position better the countries with regards to their nature resources and this new geopolitical situation where we have resilient issues, economies are under shocks, but at the same time, maybe these are opportunities for doing things in a different way. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Maria. Our next opening speaker is Ellen Boleski, co-founder of the South of the Future and CEO of Ecological, representing the World Climate Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Ellen.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I will have to read because I speak too much sometimes. Thank you. But it's fantastic to be here. I know many of you that are here, some Brazilians that I admire very much, and there are many other people that I'm willing to know better. And something amazing about this climate weeks where we meet each other and we meet people, new people that are working with climate and people we already know is that all of that we are doing together really inspires me and makes me believe that we're going to achieve a better climate situation in the future. I'm the CEO and founder of Ecological and the co-founder of South of the Future. South of the Future is a platform that's amplifying the voices of those making the difference in the global South, starting right in Brazil in areas such as social and environmental impact, science, entrepreneurship, and technology. We are very excited to be in the second year here in London. Our first event in London was right here last year. And I'm very thrilled to be here also to announce that we are making a very big event in the São Paulo Climate Week at MASP. MASP is our Museum of Art of São Paulo, and also at Museu das Favelas, where we have here Jairo Malta representing. This movement that we're making, like in London, New York, São Paulo, and during the COPs, is really aiming to bring the people that are making things happen in the territories to speak at those stages. So to be here supporting this event is super important for us. We truly believe that the Global South is brimming with innovation, natural resources, and the know-how we need to combat climate change and ensure just transition. There is something unique about how we do things in the Global South. We are collaborative, caring, and bursting with creativity when it comes to problem solving. I want to thank ICS and the other partners to make this happen together, and also World Climate Foundation, and two corporates that support us in Brazil. That's C6 Bank and Fundação Toyota. I wish you all a great event, and I hope we keep inspiring each other.
Thank you very much, Ellen. We're now going to move to the keynote presentation, introducing the paper being launched today. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Luiz Awazu de Pereira da Silva. Luiz is visiting professor in practice at CETEX and former Deputy General Manager of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. He is the lead author of the report that forms the basis of today's discussion. Luiz, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Bom dia. Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, everyone, for the nice introductions. So I'm very pleased to, on behalf of my co-authors here, to present to you this paper on investment-led growth in Brazil. And let me just set up the context. Can Brazil be a sort of an example for other emerging market and development economies in terms of the transition going pari passu, hand in hand with growth and investment? If we were, since we are in the World Cup, football World Cup season, obviously, if we were talking about football, Brazil would not be anymore an example, unfortunately for us. But, you know, maybe for the transition, there are some ideas we can. The departure point is that we are talking here about a global structural transformation of the economy. And we see three forces and shocks interacting, reshaping production, trade, investment. Of course, the climate ecological transition, but also, unfortunately, the geopolitical fragmentation, and of course, this is good news, the rapid technological change. Now, our departure point is that these are not, I rephrase, not temporary shocks. These are long-term structural changes happening and that will continue to happen. And what is the effect of this? These things are reshaping the industrial geography. They are basically relocating production near where cheap renewable production of energy is. The changes in relative prices between renewables and fossil fuels is going to continue. Renewable prices are going to fall. We have a new way to think of global value chains and supply chains because of security. I think everybody noticed how important geography and security is. And finally, all this is creating a movement in terms of capital reallocation to where profitable sectors are, where the GVCs are going to be transformed, and where the countries that can benefit from it will be. So we confess that we have some inspirations here, and you can see the man of creative discretion story, but also Lord Stearns in terms of the new growth story linking renewables with technologies and with growth. And the issue is how can Brazil, and perhaps also other emerging markets, use and transform these ideas, these global transitions into higher productivity, into more industrial upgrading, into better and more jobs, into greater resilience for the ecological transition and perhaps even net zero, and of course also fairness in growth and inclusive development. So we all know we have, in Brazil, we are blessed. We have clean energy, agricultural scale, biodiversity, critical minerals, water and land availability. And then the idea is how to transform these Brazilian exceptional structural endowments into global strategic assets that will benefit from investment. So that these assets are not just in the old-fashioned, very passive comparative advantages, the story of the old commodity exporter, but we can be seeing these assets as being instruments in reshaping global value chains, in attracting private investments and foreign direct investment, and of course with this driving structural transformation and generating inclusive growth. So if Brazil can industrialize these comparative advantage, well, Brazil can become, and other emerging markets can become, a low-carbon industrial platform, a provider of transition solutions for the global economy, and also a global destination for global investment and large flows of FDI. You know this. I don't need to spend too much time. The advantage of Brazil are well known. This is the percentage of electricity generation from renewable sources. The more blue you have, the better you are. You can see the position of Brazil in the rest of the world. Another feature is the presence of critical minerals in terms of production or reserves. You can see the position of Brazil here in terms of some of the critical minerals that are necessary for the transition. Renewable water resources, the amounts of natural replenished fresh water from natural causes. You can see also Brazil with plentiful of that. And you can see also, this is absolutely well known, the amount of biodiversity that Brazil has here in terms of the dark green, the better in the rest of the world. So take all this and think of a new geopolitical, macro and micro interpretation of what the transition is about. So we took the position that the ecological transition is not just an energy transition, not just like decarbonizing the energy sector. It creates a possibility of change, of a new growth and development paradigm. It's as if you can see the transition as a spatial reorganization of production, as a repricing of natural capital, of biodiversity, and a new dynamic concept for the old-fashioned comparative advantage notion in trade theory. Think of this in terms of how do you see in the fossil fuel era the fact that energy was capable of moving close to industrial sites and to industrial places where production took place because of the capacity to move oil through oil tankers, to pipeline, and so on and so forth. In the renewable era, this is falling apart and reversing. The fall of renewable cost and the fact that you have higher security risks, which we are all observing, for example, with the Strait of Hormuz, makes the industry increasingly moving towards the places where you have the capacity to produce cheap and renewable energy. So it's a change in paradigm that the new conditions are calling for. And this, of course, makes A country like Brazil, but maybe others, gain strategic competitiveness if they can think of these advantages and think of utilizing them in this strategic way. So it means that if you take all this, you can sort of think of a new interpretation, a sort of a new type of development path for developing countries. It's not as if you can say, look, the old-fashioned, you just sort of do the straightforward macro fundamentals, straight fiscal adjustment, and then you reduce risk aversion towards investment. You then have growth and then redistribution. That's one way, traditional way of doing this. Or you can say, look, we are not going to invest too much. We're going to just grow by consumption, by transfer, by redistribution. Or the other way, the third way, will say, look, we are going to use our assets to do traditional protectionism and continue to export commodities. No. What we are proposing in the paper is a discussion about an investment-led development strategy that is based on precisely a bit of gradual fiscal consolidation, but moreover, the industrialization of the comparative advantages I was referring to with strategic openness, particularly to capital flows and to FDI, a catalytic industrial policy, and a coordinated macro financial framework. So this is supposed to create a self-reinforcing cycle, which I'm going to illustrate here. If Brazil is, and many developing countries are, in a sort of a low growth, low productivity, inequality type of departure point, but you engineer your targeted set of policy instruments I was referring to crowd in private investment, which means a bit of consolidation, this public spending that is catalytic, the usage of balance sheets of the overall public sector with blended finance, using a stable and credible macro framework, then you can have these selective industrial policies, agricultural policies, and investment facilitation moving in. And then, of course, you can have higher growth, higher investment, and better and more jobs. Now, is it this beautiful story automatic? Of course not, guys. Of course not. You have risks. And you can see them, plentiful of them here. Emerging markets, and Brazil is case in point, has a number of issues with regulatory, bureaucracy, red tape, infrastructural bottlenecks. So we have to think not only of the positive circle that I'm referring to, but also how to remove some of these risks so that this virtuous circle can be triggered. And of course, at the end, it's about how the macroeconomic framework can allow to escape this situation of low investment and low growth and low productivity. I really stress that the financing, as you know, in climate transition is important, but we are not talking here about financing the transition with profligacy and unlimited fiscal spending. On the contrary, we think that the investment expansion needs to be financed to a bit of higher public savings, which means that we have to do a bit of fiscal consolidation, but you have also to mobilize higher private savings by generating more growth and generating more profitability of the investment. You have to attract foreign direct investment, and think of the framework as using public resources not as the main financing source of the transition, but as a catalyst so that you can trigger and improve debt sustainability, you can improve the fiscal position, you can improve growth and the savings picture in your domestic economy. Again, is it something that is automatic, guys? Of course not. Because of the risks, because of the inherent process of mobilizing foreign direct investment is not automatic. So you can have a delay in this process of crowding in that I was referring to. If there is a delay, you have to adapt your strategy. You have to tailor it to the circumstances so that you don't generate macroeconomic imbalances that deteriorate the process and the strategy. So just to finish, you have some numbers here. Don't get too much into it. Just notice that in the red bubbles, you have the logic of the main instruments that we are considering from a macro perspective. A little bit of usage of scarce public resources, such as public investment, incentives in de-risking, so that you can mobilize more private investment. So the arrows pointing to the top, the mobilization of higher levels of private investment. At the same time, also financing by foreign direct investment. And also on the bottom, the circle showing that you make a fiscal adjustment effort so that at the end, and these are the blue arrows, all this, the higher level of private investments and the fiscal effort results in a higher level of GDP real growth and also a lower level of real long-term interest rates. Now, good news, this is happening, and this is my end story here. This is happening in a moment where there is a lot of good opportunities for Brazil, but also for other emerging market and developing economies in terms of the global transition. You have a number of people managing a lot of assets, asset managers globally, pension funds, that have a lot of resources that are being channeled through the transition in terms of sectors of renewable energy investment. And if Brazil can capture just a small fraction of this, and if any emerging market can capture a small fraction of this thinking of where should I position myself in this new way that global value chains are going to be designed with energy, security, fragmentation, well, I can certainly trigger a positive growth, inclusive process in my own country. So, as we know, and this is also bad news for the world, but also you have to be considered, there is an inevitable geopolitical fragmentation that is taking place. You have a country that is used to be the provider of global safe assets that is shifting its relative risk vis-à-vis other emerging markets. I'm of course talking here about the policies pursued by the Trump administration in the US, which of course are damaging the world economy, but at the same time are creating a possibility for a reallocation of assets and portfolios towards investments that are located in emerging market economies. So to finish, should we do something? Well, yes, we should do along these lines as we propose in this report for discussion, and particularly because the cost of not doing anything is particularly high. Think of all the extreme weather-related events, the fiscal cost of this, the cost on inflation of heat. We are experiencing here in London today, but also in Europe, one of the manifestations of climate change, and you know very well that this affects financial stability, price stability, and also the living of our society. So the cost of inaction is very high. So I stop here and thank you very much, and I hope that we will continue this discussion throughout this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. It is now my pleasure to invite Isabella Teixeira. Isabella is a former Minister of the Environment of Brazil, an internationally respected voice on climate policy and sustainable development, and currently serves on the International Advisory Board of SEBRI. Isabella, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. I'd like, first of all, to apologize myself, but my GPS, I think that's still in Brazil, and I was lost in London, so that's why I arrived late here. I do apologize. But, Maria, thank you very much for inviting me to be here, particularly because this is not only about the paper, but the political momentum that we have today around the world and in Brazil. climate politics is one of the most important challenges that I understand when we have to move in the new power politics dynamics in the world. And this means, in my understanding, how important climate politics is to set the future. And for this, we need economy. We need numbers, and also with the narrative, with macro and micro economic perspectives, in a way that you could go beyond the green wishing of this agenda. This is a pragmatic approach that shows to Brazil not only the opportunity to take or to make new decisions, consider our future, but to understand that it's really a strategic route for our development. Climate change is a critical issue for development in Brazil, not because of the threats that we are exposed or risks, but because we are a country with alternatives to change. This is very important to observe. We can change, we have choice, we have alternatives, and not necessarily dependent on from other countries. So the opportunity to redesign our economy and our vision of development is absolutely strategic in my understanding, because the future we need to address security and also risk sharing. And this part of the reality not only arises because of power politics or geopolitics, but because nature changed. We're absolutely exposed to nature today, and science is not enough to address or to give the answers that you need, because my understanding after the 1.5 overshooting, we are lost. Okay, this is really, we need to have enabling conditions for science to come back and to work with us, but together with the economy and together with innovation and digitalization. We are finally, we are part of, as a problem, part of one of the three tensions that understand the world is exposed today. The first one is growth without inclusion. This is very important to be observed, particularly for emerging developing countries where inequalities are so high, not social inequalities, but also technological inequalities. The second tension is about digitalization and the speed of transformation in the world. And of course, the third one is green transition and the trade-offs, okay? Because we have the traditional energies in the room, like particularly fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas. You have coal phasing out probably, but we're fully dependent on oil and gas, and Brazil is a strategic player for oil and gas in the future, not only in the present. Our reserves on gas are really very important if you come to discuss industrial policy and the transitions, what's emerging. And the other side, Brazil, is really important country for renewable energy and for low carbon tropical agriculture. So we are able to discuss, based on biofuels and biomass, food security and energy security together. And this is really a unique opportunity to understand our options, our alternatives, our risks, and how private sector should be and must be a strategic partner, not only for investments in the financial sector, not only for investments, but to be a partner, to be a partner to make sure that Brazil can really take decisions to consider the future. All the conditions that we have today that allow Brazil to discuss low-carbon economy with really comfortable situations, the decisions were made 60 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 50 years ago. So it's time, and I think that the paper shows this very well, it's time to take new decisions based on in a pragmatic way, based on the reality, understand the trade-offs of short-term perspective, but more than this, understand that climate agenda is really one of the pillars of the development that we need to promote this century. I don't like the idea to move forward based on threats. I prefer to build up on fear. I prefer to build up based on hope and partnership. So what you have here is a really concrete first step to bring economic sector and also innovation, technological, and social sector, social people, social players to discuss this based on the reality and not based on green wishing. I'm not saying about greenwashing, I'm saying about green wishing. Okay, it's like, I wish this. No. We need to decouple things, land things, grounded things, be pragmatic, and understand that this country has alternatives, yes, but we have responsibility not only with our society, but with the world. And this means to renew the expression of soft power of Brazil and the relevance of Brazil for the next years in the world. So I'd like to thank you very much, the authors, for this provocation. I was honored to review the paper. For the first time, I was so hysterical, I confess, because it's like a dream. I thought, come on. Trends, loud things, please, ground things. But more than this, I'd like to thank you very much because you are really important Brazilian economists and also relevant voice, political and economic voice in our country and the world. And this means also that we are going to climate governance, the challenge to have climate governance not only inside the UNFCCC, outside, and consider the coalitions, the like-minded blocs, all the political and geopolitical arrangements addressing climate change today. Okay, I don't know any other blocs around the world, like BRICS Plus and other, everyone discuss climate change today. So it's very important that Brazil could have not only the tools of the Paris Agreement, but more than this, have a new mindset, understand the economy, and understand our challenges, our challenge to really a better or best regulation, and more than this, our responsibility to change our country. So Brazilians, let's take care of Brazil, and really hope that the world can come with us. Thank you very much for this. I wish you really a fantastic debate. Don't buy it, okay? Question everything. But I'm sure that would you like to come to Brazil to drink a low-carbon caipirinha? I'm waiting for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabella. We now turn to our first panel discussion, which will examine the report's key findings and explore how Brazil can translate its structural advantages into investment, productivity growth, and long-term economic transformation. The session will be moderated by Fernanda Jimenez, Senior Research Lead on Private Capital Mobilization at CTEX and one of the report's co-authors. Joining Fernanda on stage will be Luiz Awazu Pereira da Silva, Jorge Abachi, and Rodrigo Lima. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much, Nirusha. Thank you, Nirusha, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. It's a great pleasure to be able to present and to discuss the key findings of this discussion paper that we are launching today. We, at some point, will just put up again the QR code where you can just download the English version and also a preliminary version of the translation to Portuguese of our discussion paper. And we are a little bit late, actually, in terms of the development of the event, but we'll try to catch up, so we also have time for networking towards the end and to discuss bilaterally with us, with other speakers as well. So the idea of this panel would be basically to present this opportunity for us co-authors to discuss key findings of the paper, but also to move beyond the findings itself and also to reflect on implementation challenges. The idea here would not be for us to present the sections individually, but to discuss these implementations. So we are going to try and make it as interactive as possible and perhaps even allow some Q&A with the audience, if that's okay. So Jorge, I'm going to start with you. We talk a lot about industrializing comparative advantages in the paper. Can you just walk us through what do we actually mean by industrializing comparative advantage, please?
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Fernanda, and thank you for being here with us. Very quickly, for several decades, lead economists basically developed the idea that comparative advantages could be a weakness of developing economies. That's why they proposed many of them proposed ways to industrialize, to find a way for them to develop new comparative advantages, for identifying some new perspectives for them to leave away the typical comparative advantages, and most of them use the case of the Asian tigers as a kind of a model for them. However, because of all those things that that were presented by Luis, climate change, new technologies, geopolitics, things are going towards comparative advantages. And they are changing relative prices in favor of those countries that may have ways to produce clean energy, nature-based solutions, biomass, critical minerals, and all those things. So the fact that relative prices are changing and very rapidly, and also the fact that things such as energy are changing from the very physical side of the story, as was mentioned, is for 150 years, we got used to think that energy was being produced in one place and moved to another place. That's the fossil fuels. But because of the clean energy, and clean energy is becoming cheaper than fossil fuels, and a lot more important for several reasons, we can no longer, as before, move electrons and molecules from the point where they are produced towards the point where they are consumed. So that's the very key point of power shoring. So at least part of the production, we have to move to where energy is being produced. And this is giving, joint with the other points, giving a way for developing economies to develop all these new menu of solutions where industrializing comparative advantage is pretty much the expression that reveals where the opportunities are.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Josh. That's super helpful. And how can Brazil transform these structural advantages into dynamic competitive advantages? That's another one of the other themes of the paper as well.
Well, very clearly, as was mentioned by Luis, Brazil has to articulate policies that enable investors to come and to develop those comparative advantages. Not only because Brazil can be a good place to do business, but because Brazil can provide the world with solutions at scale. At scale, this is critical. There are many other countries that also have clean energy and perhaps critical minerals, good land and water, and so on and so forth. But Brazil, different from most other countries, can provide all those things at scale. So the best thing that the government could do is coordination, articulation, and good regulatory framework, joint with the fiscal, good fiscal space, and joint with smart fiscal policies that may help accelerate all those investments.
Thank you, Jorge, for also touching upon these implementation challenges already. We are going to come back to that. Rodrigo, now turning to you. We talk a lot about industrial sector policies as well, but we do address agriculture, land use, and bioeconomy in the paper. So what opportunities do you see emerging from these sectors and also the sustainable value chain for Brazil?
Thanks, Fernanda. Thanks, everyone, for attending our event and listening to our ideas. And I think with agriculture, Brazil has strategic endowment under the geopolitics and the challenges of the world to continue feeding Brazilians, but to export, as George just mentioned. We can do this in scale, and access to food, it's something extremely relevant. Combining agriculture with bioeconomy, and by bioeconomy, please understand integrating small value chains and socioeconomic people that are there, but they are not integrated in value chains, and they need support. So if we combine agriculture with bioeconomy and natural capital, including conservation of forests on farms, that is important in Brazil, and as Isabella mentioned, the low carbon, we've been discussing this in Brazil for several years, and we have policies and so on. So if we integrate the development of resilient and sustainable agriculture with bioeconomy, with natural capital, we will be in a much more, we will be better positioned to attract investments, foreign direct investment, the role of private investors, the role of MDBs and such, the broad range of sources for finance, if we are able to integrate and promote resilient and sustainable agriculture. And then there's the whole challenges of coping with deforestation, of integrating technology to smallholders and so on. Because if we do that, we will be in a position to really develop, generate socioeconomic development, and be prepared to support the world with those assets as well.
Great, thank you. You already started talking about the challenges here, but let's just explore these challenges a little bit more. So, of course, I mean, there are many advantages related to natural capital and how this could translate to sustainable agriculture value chains. But what are the key challenges preventing these opportunities to be translated into investment, productivity growth?
Yeah, Fernanda, this is extremely relevant. We are at the London Climate Week. Finance is the core center of the climate change agenda and the development agenda in a broader way. So Brazil has a lot of strengths and a lot of power, but we need to tackle deforestation, to disconnect agriculture from deforestation. We need to integrate smallholders and medium farmers on technology, because there's a lot of good things going on already. We are talking about the use of AI and agriculture 4.0 and so on, but there's a bigger size of farmers that need support, because otherwise they will continue practicing a primary mode of agriculture that is not good for the environment and not good for producing food, because low productivity, soil degradation, and so on. So we need to disconnect from deforestation. We need to support integration of farmers into an innovation mode world based on technology and projects and investments to projects and so on, to be able to diversify products, to get to new value chains, to really thrive this sector as an asset connected to the natural capital that we have. If we do this, including restoring degraded land, that is a very important policy from Brazil, the Raiz action agenda launched on COP30, because restoring degraded land, every country has, and it's extremely important. If we disconnect deforestation, if we restore degraded land, if we integrate producers into technology adoption and deployment, we will really seize the opportunity to get to attract investments and be a food powerhouse and connected to nature conservation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Jorge, just come back into you. Would you be able to explore a little bit the concept of geography of production that we discussed on the paper? Specifically, how are the ecological transition and the reorganization of the global economy that Luis just presented a little bit on his slides, how are these changing the geography of production and possibly creating new opportunities for Brazil, but I mean beyond Brazil, for other countries like Brazil. Could you please just reflect a little bit on that, please? Thank you.
No, thank you, Fernanda, for this question. We got used to think that FDI was driven by labor costs. That's what happened over from the 1980s until the 2010s or something like that, for 30 to 40 years. So to be more precise, since the 80s when China came on board, and but labor cost is no longer the main driver of international investment. More and more, because of technological transformation, technological changes, robotics, internet, and even more important, because energy is becoming the most critical input for production in several sectors. Then geography of investments is changing, and energy is becoming the very critical factor driving decisions. But more than that, geopolitics is also affecting the geography of investments. So boards of big companies are now taking decisions not only based on where energy is, but where you may find places where you may get not only efficiency, but also resiliency. So that's why we developed the concept of conditional efficiency. So efficiency based on resilience. So that's to say that countries like Brazil, but not only Brazil, may benefit a lot somehow, joint with energy, biomass, nature-based solutions, and some other things, and take part on the, let's say, on the international map of investments. So that's what are the things that are changing the geography of investments, and will probably become even more important over the coming years.
Thank you, Jorge. And Luis, now for you. I mean, back in January when we started discussing this paper, the first sections on agriculture, on industrial policy, they were pretty much, in terms of, we just wanted to capture on paper what we knew about these opportunities that are already there for Brazil to capture. But then we always knew that, the macroeconomic policy should be somewhat clear in the paper as well for us to be able to put that as a feasible strategy for the country. So I basically wanted to ask you, how can this ambitious investment strategy be reconciled with fiscal sustainability and macroeconomic stability in general? If you could, of course, you touched upon this on your slides, but if we can just share a little bit more of our own discussions as well, it would be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. Absolutely. This is not a paper that is recommending spending its way out of trouble, okay? We are absolutely aware that if you want to attract investment on the private sector side, you need to ensure macroeconomic stability in a country. Now, what we are advocating is to design the fiscal adjustment process in a way that sort of doesn't use its whole fiscal space in financing the transition itself, but triggers private crowding in of private investors. So you have scarce public sector resources. You have to intelligently allocate them into areas where the marginal return of what you are allocating creates multiplier effects on private sector investments. Because look, after all, the transition is about assuming a certain number of risks for a certain period. The transition has assets that have very high social returns in the long term, but in the sort of the short term are uncertain. So you don't know exactly if they are going to be profitable. Somebody has to sort of take the role of putting this risk temporarily into one's balance sheet. And of course, the one's balance sheet is the public sector balance sheet because it has the capacity to sustain it in a longer period of time. However, you cannot just overload the public sector balance sheet. So that's why you do need some fiscal adjustment. But this fiscal adjustment has to sort of be, again, very effective and has to be fair. Why is it that people are so reluctant to accept fiscal adjustment today in many, many countries? Because it is perceived as unfair. You are distributing subsidies to billionaires, you're not taxing them, but at the same time you're asking ordinary people to sort of tighten their belts. Of course people will react negatively. So we are proposing a political economy of the fiscal adjustment that is precisely effective in terms of mobilizing and crowding in private investment, and at the same time has a fairness component in terms of the sort of the intricacies, the mechanics of how fiscal adjustment is conducted at the country level.
Thank you, Luis. That's very helpful. And that links very nicely with some work that we do at CITEX as well. Of course, we mentioned the paper, which is basically on private capital mobilization. So I invite everyone to, of course, read the paper because we have, we kind of put together the three main barriers, basically preventing private capital mobilization to happen, which will be, essential to this strategy to be put in place. And then we discuss, these three layers, such as macro and policy barriers, project level barriers, and financial barriers. And then in the financial barriers, we do discuss a little bit of the importance of blended finance instruments, for example, as one of the main de-risking opportunities, and how the government can really use its balance sheet as in a catalytic way. So definitely inviting you all to read the paper in more detail. I now would like to just open the floor to see whether we do have any questions for the panelists. Yes. Yes, I can see a hand there, and two questions here. Do we have mics for the floor, or perhaps? Yes? Okay, thank you. Just a minute, please. We are going to get there. Thank you. Here, over here, yes. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Aurelio from ECO. Thank you very much for the presentation. I haven't read the paper, okay? So, but you start with assumption of the resources, and then, well, I saw the presentation. You start with these assumptions that we have the resources, and you draw a financial path for a transformation that goes to 2035. But I would like to give you the opportunity to talk more about the institutions that we need to strengthen to make this transformation happen. We are living in a moment in Brazil as the democracy is quite fragile. We are shifting, pending left to right. And this long-term planning, we need a certain governance institutions to guide this transformation. So I would like to hear which kind of, if you reflect on that, what kind of suggestion would you give to lead in terms of institution?
Thank you so much. May I just suggest that we collect the other question and then we can answer collectively. Thank you. It's here. Just here in the front, please, and then here. Adriano here. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had the opportunity to go through the paper. Rob sent me a copy. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It's a wonderful paper. You could bring it in 5 months. Hats off to you. And thank you very much, and congratulations to all of you for producing such a nice paper. I'm absolutely clear that this needs to be done, and this can be done. But I have only one issue about the financing part. And I think I do find some inconsistency in macro numbers. I think the way you are proposing is to, finance investment partly by way of foreign direct investment to start with, and then partly by way of fiscal consolidation, that means government reduces its dish saving, that it increases its savings. That's how I understood the paper. But if that is the case, if you're trying to finance, that's perfectly fine, there's no problem. You can finance it by FDI. But then it should get reflected in your current account deficit. But I find your current account deficit is improving. So if you are attracting more FDI to finance your, investment, then your current account deficit has to expand. So but I find it's improving. That's one. And my feeling is going forward, because the whole idea of your this investment ecological transition is to make Brazil as a hub of, renewables. In that case, I'm sure that going forward, you would have more exports and less imports. In that case, your current account deficit actually could decline. Going forward, I'm not talking immediately. It could take few years. If this policy really works, it could lead to current account surplus, lower current account deficit, or even surplus. That means you may be even importing savings. So my point is, if investment is to be financed, why not to be financed by domestic saving? Because your domestic saving rate is very low and much lower than many other emerging market economies. But I find you want domestic savings to finance investment only in the second round, but not in the first round. That's my suggestion, because you can finance through foreign direct investment, but then your current account deficit needs to rise. In that case, it would need to be assessed whether it is sustainable or not at this moment. That's number one. Number two, a lot of focus in the paper has been on, promoting investment. But though there is a mention of improving productivity, but I think capital needs to be much more productive than what we find in Brazil. Let me give you some numbers. Incremental capital output ratio is a rough measure of indicating like how much capital you need to produce 1 unit of output. For Brazil, it is something like 7.5 or so. Latest number, if you take GDP, it's 7.9. For India, at one time we had 4, now it is 5. So that means you need 8 units of capital, or 7 units of capital to produce 1 unit of output. So I think there is a lot of room to improve productivity. I would suggest like almost half of the improvement in your GDP growth should come from improvement in investment, and half should come from improvement in productivity. Actually, if you can do both at the same time, then your growth should be much higher. I would stop, and thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. 2 excellent questions. I would just, if possible, just ask that we are super brief, so we can actually have these type of discussions, also how the same discussion resonates with all the emerging market countries, including India, in the second panel, if that's okay. So, Jorge, Rodrigo, Luis, who wants to?
Very quickly, thank you very much for the questions. I start with your question on institutions. Institutions are obviously extremely important today, tomorrow, and yesterday. And governance, transparency, and accountability are the very basic things for decision makers who are willing to invest. They take a lot of attention, and so on and so forth. Having said that, for those investments to take place, they will require a better regulatory framework and institutions and so on and so forth. I just want to raise one specific point. I agree with you, but we have to take into account relative and absolute situations. Brazil is perhaps being challenged by some institutional issues, as you mentioned. But in relative terms, Brazil is not worse than many other places. Perhaps it is even improving its position, not because Brazil is necessarily doing his homework, but because the world in general is worsening. So that's why so many funds and investors are now considering Brazil. That's not to say that we should stop improving institutions, not at all. But we have to look Brazil in perspective, not in absolute terms. And then on your comments on productivity, productivity is at the heart of our proposition. And why? Because we are saying that by industrializing comparative advantages, we will make the rural areas, agriculture, clean energy, critical minerals, and all those things, create activities in urban areas where low productivity is very much rooted, informality and all those things. So we are bridging rural and urban areas through industrialized comparative advantage. So part of our growth will come from productivity. Why? Because of the value chains on SAF, on green steel, and all those things that are mentioned in the paper.
So examples. Yes, indeed, on the bureaucratic thing, Brazil has plenty of things that it has to do. Examples. The process of designing projects and implementing it has to be improved, and we discussed with the National Development Bank, the BNDES, and the private sector. This is a kind of very, very ongoing process that needs to continue. So many things like this will have to happen in order to remove some of the, what is called in Brazil, the Brazil cost, the custo Brasil, that we are fully aware of, and that represents a sort of synthesis of, I think in India you know this very well too, so that many things can be done and that are sort of designed already, listed already. On the macro thing, the effort of adjustment needs to be from the public sector, of course, sort of this gradual fiscal adjustment that will bring more savings, public savings, but it has also to come from the increase in private savings, particularly corporate savings. And this strategy with more growth and more profitability of corporations will certainly contribute to this adjustment process. FDI is only part of the financing, and of course, the way in which this framework is designed is not from a model, it's just from a macro consistency framework. In a sense, think of Brazil as the kind of almost the opposite of the China model. China overinvested and underconsumed. Brazil has to be a bit more on the investment side and sort of control more the consumption and increase its private savings.
Under the regulatory part, I would take the opportunity to say that if we are about to use our endowments on agriculture and natural capital and bioeconomy, if Brazil does not control deforestation or is not very transparent about what it's doing to tackle that, we will not attract investment, simply, no matter what government is in place. And I completely understand that we have elections and so on, but no matter who will be in charge next year, if Brazil does not control, does not enforce the different policies, not just the bigger view of deforestation, but the different policies we have, we will simply not attract investment no matter who is in charge in Brasilia. So this is one of the provocations of the study as well, when it comes to this point, that we must do it, because otherwise we will continue business as usual totally, and this is good for the country. It is not.
Thank you so much, everyone. In the interest of time, I think we, unfortunately, will have to pause here. But I mean, we're super excited also to have the second panel, where we're going to discuss how this same discussion resonates across all the emerging market countries. Just before we finish, I just want to acknowledge, actually, that we do have a fifth co-author, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. But Manuel, thank you so much for working with us on this piece. And thank you, Rob and Maria, for supporting our work together here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernanda, and thank you to all our panelists. Our second panel broadens the discussion beyond Brazil and considers how investment-led ecological transition strategies may apply across emerging and developing economies. The session will be moderated by Mo Safar, Head of Private Capital Mobilisation at CTEX. Joining Mo are Janak Raj, Senior Fellow at the Centre for Social and Economic Progress and former Executive Director of the Reserve Bank of India. Amar Bhattacharya, Senior Fellow in Global Economy and Development at Brookings. Evie Robertson from the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Graham Knight, Climate and Nature Councillor at the British Embassy in Brazil. And Aline Halimatu-Sadia, Head of the Green Economy and Climate Research Group at the Institute for Economic and Social Research of Indonesia. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thanks very much, Narusha. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if it's afternoon yet, actually. Good late morning. Thank you to our panelists for joining. As Fernanda set out at the end of the last session, as the discussion was kind of trending towards, now we're going to explore the relevance of the Brazilian experience for other emerging economies. Key themes for discussion are the importance of mobilizing investment for structural transformation, which we obviously touched on extensively, moving from opportunity to implementation, and of course the role of international cooperation. So I'm very pleased to be joined by a panel from a great geographic diversity to hear about the experiences of other countries from both emerging markets and donor countries alike. Janak, I might start with you if that's okay. Firstly, very simply, what parallels do you see between Brazil and India?
Yeah, no, I have, as I mentioned, yeah, sorry. So there are some similarities. Yeah, there are some similarities, but there are also some dissimilarities. They are very, stark. Dissimilarities are also very contrast. Let me explain to you. The major similarity is that both are domestic demand-driven economies. Like the share of consumption is domestic demand is very high. Same in case of both in case of India and Brazil. And both the economies are service-led economies driven on the supply side. The share of services is something like 80%. I was surprised to see 80% in GDP. In India, it was 60% in GDP in Brazil and 50% in India. It was at one point of time it was about 60% or so. And both the economies face fiscal challenges. Gross fiscal deficit for India is also very high. Same is the case for Brazil. And in the case of Brazil, debt to GDP ratio even higher than that of India. So it's a huge challenge, as it was already pointed out in the previous session. It's although they are promoting investment, but they want it to be done in a manner which is fiscally prudent and sustainable, which is a wonderful thing. So these are and then of course, both the economies have, a flexible inflation targeting framework. Brazil has 3% inflation with plus minus 1.5%. We have 4% inflation target with plus minus 2%. But let me come to the dissimilarities between Brazil and India. The major, it was mentioned in the previous session that there is China is at the one end and the Brazil is on the other end, but I think India comes in the middle. We have a saving rate, which is around saving investment rate is around 32% or so, which is not as high as it is in China, but it is not as low as it is in Brazil. But at one point of time, our saving rate was very high. It has come down. It was a saving investment rate was something like 36%, but now it has come down. That's the major. That's a major contrast I see between the two economies. Another contrast is that we have if you see energy, we are net importer. To take crude oil, 85% of our crude oil requirements, they are imported from other parts of the world. whereby I think Brazil is net exporter of crude oil. So that increases our vulnerability to any oil price shock. We have seen that happening recently. So these are the major, two major contrasts I find. But I find if you see overall, there's a need to, I would say, if you want me to give some suggestion, there's need to, as I mentioned in the previous, my intervention also, there's need to improve the saving rate of, Brazil. And I think we also need to improve saving rate, but not to that extent. I will stop here, yeah.
Thanks very much. I think you started touching on this in your comment earlier, the balance between transformation and macroeconomic stability. Can you say a bit more about that? Because it's a difficult balance to strike.
No, that's basically, macroeconomic stability is a prerequisite for, any transformation. Without macroeconomic stability, it's very difficult to achieve any transformation. So for macroeconomic stability, basically means you have low and stable rate of inflation, you have stable exchange rate, you have sustainable fiscal deficit, you have, some cushion in the form of foreign exchange reserves. Unless and until you have that, it's very difficult to achieve that kind of transformation, whatever transformation you want. So I'm happy to note that in the previous session it was mentioned, I'm repeatedly mentioning that while Brazil wants to achieve investment, high rate of investment and wants to undergo ecological transition, they want to do it in a prudent, fiscally prudent manner, which is a very good thing. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Amar, if I could turn to you next. I mean, you've been a great champion of reforming the international financial architecture to move towards, among other things, an investment-led approach. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see the need for the international architecture to evolve to match this challenge at the global level?
Thanks, Mo, and let me just begin by congratulating the team that prepared the paper. It's really a very, very important contribution, both to Brazil and to thinking now in a more granular way across the world. So I really want to, and I'm going to base a lot of my comments, obviously, based on the analytical insights from the paper. So first, I would say they're very important to recognize that across the world, we are starting from a point of underinvestment. If you look at the last 2 decades, there has been a decline in investment all across the world, and particularly in some parts of the world. So if you look at Latin America, for example, the net capital formation per capita is barely positive, okay? So you don't really have even the basis for growth. In Africa, it's 0. In Asia, it's positive, but lower than it has historically been. And so there's a macro reason, a very Keynesian macro reason right now, and or I shouldn't say Keynesian, it's just a more Solow-likely reason to boost investment. Second, we have structural factors now at play which suggests that most countries need structural investment. In Brazil, these have been long-standing, and certainly the green industrialization is an opportunity, but we know that, lack of investments in transport, in logistics and cities have been a source of competitive disadvantage for Brazil for some time, So in some sense, there is a kind of a catch-up of a stock of investment. The quality of infrastructure is probably the most important indicator of long-term competitiveness. And Brazil has been an outlier. The rates of investment in infrastructure, both public and private, in Brazil is the lowest in the region and far, far below what we have in Asia. The third is climate change. And climate change has 2 impacts. One is it increases the urgency of this investment, not just for the global emissions point of view, but for the local resilience point of view. And the second part of it, of course, is a lot of these new investments are very, very capital, not only intensive, but capital upfront. And that's the challenge that we face in the investment proposition we have. And so it's in that context I want to talk a little bit about not just the international financial architecture, but what I call the 2 sides. One is a prerequisite is for countries to come up with really well-articulated transformation strategies with macroeconomic sustainability, as Janak was pointing out. Transformative strategies. And, in that, and I see Lisbeth somewhere here, it's actually about managing the transition. It's recognizing that you have to invest in things like people and skills. It's not just a question of saying, I'm going to invest here and everything will fall into place. And the reality is very, very few countries today have really articulated long-term strategies for this transformation. It's not ghost planning. It's actually understanding that these are the pressure points, these are the opportunities. And for example, on energy, which is probably the most important foundation of this, very few countries actually have long-term investment plans and strategies to support them. We are, we had discussion a couple of months ago comparing India with Indonesia in this instance, and both countries are quite deficient in the kind of planning that is necessary for their long-term transitions. So the countryside actually is the foundation, and indeed that's what the paper points to, and it's very much focusing on all dimensions of the transition, including the just transition. Second, on resources. So for most countries, of course, the resources have to come domestically. And as the work of CSEP has shown, there are challenges because, for example, a country like India, which has been very, very dependent on tax revenues from fossil fuels, you move out, there's a challenge of where the fiscal revenue is going to come from. It's not that you're not, just to give the other side of it, if miraculously India could wean itself out of fossil fuel, we would be saving 10 to 15% of GDP. Think about the power of that, right? So it's not that this is not a land of opportunity, but it actually requires, again, thinking through these paths that Janak was talking about, okay? So on the external side, where there are really two big issues for countries like Brazil and India. The first, or three, I would say. First is the domestic resources. And I think in both countries, there is huge potential from carbon pricing and carbon markets, And the beauty of that is it's a transition revenue, but it finances the transition. So it's actually, eventually we will not have huge revenues, hopefully, from carbon, but in the meantime, we do. And let's tax it and let's use it for the transition. And both countries have big opportunities in that space. But of course, they also need domestic resource mobilization foundations in the public sector, including the expenditure side, and particularly around local and state finances. That's, as was mentioned, is part of the transition that has to be managed. Second, we have to ramp up on the development finance system as a whole. Now, Brazil has, perhaps China is sui generis, but Brazil has the biggest development bank of any developing country. And it's not just operating in Brazil, it operates outside Brazil. It plays a very leading edge role in the kind of pipeline development, in crowding in private sector, in the Brazil's Eco-Invest program. But it could partner better with the international system better, and that's what part of the Eco-Invest is. In India, we don't have a similar ecosystem right now, and a lot of the action that we see is really ramping this up, including the support from the multilateral development banks. I give you kind of a powerful number. In Europe, which is a developed country, the EIB is associated with 40% of the solar investment, 50% of wind, and virtually every grid that's being built in Europe. If you look at the role of multilateral development banks in the developing world, they don't even come to the 5-7% range. Okay, so we really need to ramp up long-term development finance because we need. I've encouraged that for the first time the World Bank is looking like for a 50-year loan to support grid development in India. That's the kind of finance we need. So we really need to ramp up the development finance and how the development finance works in between the national, regional, and global. The third part is private sector finance will be absolutely crucial. And Brazil is probably one of the most challenging countries in terms of the cost of capital. You know, its cost of capital in Brazil is really a big detriment to kind of the long-term investment. If you're looking at 20, 30-year type of investments, with the cost of capital that we have in Brazil, it's very, very difficult to have viable investments. Brazil has found innovative ways to deal with this, but it is a disadvantage for Brazil. India is at a lower level than Brazil or South Africa, but our cost of capital is still also relatively high compared to what it could be. And part of it is the macro factor that Janak pointed out, okay? Because you don't have the confidence, and so there's a risk premium, and in Brazil, big part of that risk premium manifests in foreign exchange. So I think the international financial architecture, therefore, I mean, there are many, many other things in this, but at the moment, in support of this big investment push, the international financial architecture has three roles. First, to support nationally led country programs at scale in a much more proactive way. Tomorrow we'll have a whole day on country platforms, just as a manifestation of that new interest. Second, we need, in some sense, a major revamp of development finance as both providing, as a partner in investment, providing really long-term, low-cost finance and crowding in private finance through de-risking and blended finance. And the third part of it we need is a scale of international and domestic private finance that can actually take most of the heat in terms of the scale of finance.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Amar. A lot to unpack there, and a nice segue to maybe Graham first on international cooperation, then Evie, if it's okay, I'll come to you on private capital mobilization and blended finance. So the second two of Amar's priorities and challenges. Graham, on the international partnership side of things, I mean, one of the things Amar touched on was on the need for cooperation between, on the one hand, a very complex network in the international financial architecture, MDBs, regional development banks, etc., development finance institutions at the country level, and of course, for all of them to have to work very closely with national players, setting the strategy, kind of Amar's first challenge. How do you see all of this fitting together? What role can international cooperation play in reducing barriers to investment?
Good question. Well, I'm going to start by saying bom dia, because I recognize lots of friends from Brazil. So I work in the British Embassy in Brasilia as the Councillor for Climate, Nature and Energy. I mean, I think, I touched on it, that it primarily needs to be demand-led. So obviously in Brazil, the UK spends a lot of our ODA finance there, but I think we have to recognize that over the last few years, there's been a convergence of a number of factors that have allowed the UK to work very closely with Brazil to have significant impact. Obviously, there was the election in 2022. A government came forward with a strong commitment to protecting the environment, to driving forward investment for the transition. You have an ecological transition plan led from the Ministry of Finance that brings in a number of government departments across the public sector system in Brazil behind a vision to kind of scale investment. Now, I mean, the report, identifies that the emerging economies need to think strategically about how they allocate resources. And I think the same goes for a country like the UK, where we have a significant international climate finance commitment overseas, but even still in Brazil, it's limited. So we have to think strategically about where we invest that money. So we focused on three areas, which I think, it's encouraging actually reading the report that a lot of what we do aligns with the recommendations. I think the first is that we, recognizing that kind of that strategic vision and that regulatory certainty is important for investors. We've supported the government of Brazil to develop national strategies around bioeconomy, national strategies around the national climate plan that I think bring a level of certainty and clarity around the vision for investors. I think the second thing that we've tried to do as the UK is look at, obviously we talk a lot about London being a centre of green finance, and looking at mechanisms to try and scale that investment from London. I think the first thing to say, it's not easy. We're at the beginning of a long pathway to scaling that investment. But I think supporting Brazil through the MDBs to develop mechanisms like Eco-Invest, like Caminho Verde, the national program for land restoration, so that those mechanisms are in place. And I think when you talk to investors, some of the biggest challenges they face are a sort of a lack of a sustainable pipeline of projects to invest in. Still, one of the challenges around the Eco-Invest program, I think it's perhaps easier when you talk about energy transition, but when you start to get into things like socio-bioeconomy, sort of the lack of investable, bankable projects is a real challenge. So we're working with Brazil and with other partners to look at how you can develop a meaningful pipeline of projects that can be invested in. And I would say the UK, in terms of investment, is in Brazil is at the start of a long journey, but we are increasingly seeing investors interested in areas like sustainable aviation fuels, like the bioeconomy, like land restoration. Still a long way to go, but I think by working with Brazil in partnership, we've managed to have a lot of success.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Graham. Evie, next, on private capital mobilization, which is the third of Amar's challenges, could you tell us, I mean, there's a really nice parallel between the paper, which talks about an investment-led approach within Brazil, and the need to use public resources kind of catalytically, and the kind of new emerging development paradigm that the UK is part of. Could you say a little bit about how you see that transformation at the international level?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having us all here today. So I work in our International Finance Directorate in the Foreign Office, and specifically on private capital mobilization and with the Inter-American Bank on Latin American investment. So one of the things the UK, sort of across the world, what we're seeing is a decline in ODA and decline in ODA funding. But really, it's a sort of chance to rethink what we're thinking around and like our investment ethos on development finance. And so the UK really is championing a move towards from donor to investor, how we can partner with institutions, specifically the development banks, where they have their on that ground capability, that expertise, and to be able to work with them to catalyze additional financing. So in a world where there is sort of less ODA, we have to be a lot more strategic. We need to move simply from like de-risking investment towards actually targeting specific market failures that we see and working out what that kind of minimum concessionality that we can provide as a government to be able to crowd in a lot more additional private finance. And then separately, so it's how we use and partner with institutions towards that blended finance. And then separately, how we can work towards like providing technical assistance with our partners, with our embassies, to be working with governments on like enabling reforms to establish and deepen those domestic capital markets. So that's elements like working on regulation to create positive investment environments. You touched upon, both of you, on bankable projects. So thinking about what that pipeline is, and thinking then around where are the sectors specifically from a private capital sector specific area that we need to be investing in. So some of the major areas to be working on are adaptation and resilience financing, nature financing, how we can work with them to create that pipeline, to create products that are attractive to institutional investors and create that commerciality so that private finance will crowd in.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Evie. And finally, Aline, Indonesia has been tackling some of these issues for a long time now. It's got a very complex but sophisticated system of coordination across government, and has been targeting foreign direct investment to to finance its energy and wider ecological transition for some years now, including through the Just Energy Transition Partnership. Can you say a little bit about what lessons Indonesia and Brazil can learn from one another?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I would like to reflect first the report to Indonesia's situation. Yeah. So Indonesia have dissimilarities with Brazil in terms of dependency on resources, critical minerals, and then also bioenergy, and then also nature. But Indonesia has quite specific problem that coal is an important commodities. Yeah. So we are one of the largest coal exporter, and then our macro condition depends on these commodities. Yeah. And we also use coal, 60% of our electricity still from coal. So, and second one is the Indonesia now is among the lowest tax ratio in the world. And I think this reflect the inability of the fiscal governance to capture kind of resource rent from the commodities, this kind of commodities. Currently, the government set up an export agency to solve the under invoicing and transfer pricing problem, but it actually creates another distortion in the market. So this also become our challenge. Many distortion in the market, energy subsidy, many kind of price regulation that makes fossil lock-in appears in Indonesia that hinders the energy transition and also decarbonization. And I think all of these problems need to be solved in like one package of reform, And the government also, what I would like to note is need to navigate the global dynamics and market, because sometimes changing in the regulation is driven by the inability of the government to predict the market because of asymmetric information, not enough information. For example, in choosing the commodities, we have nickel, but the government want to expand it into 20 more critical minerals. But I think we need to be strategic in looking at the commodities and in which value chain, within, the sectors, like when we want to develop solar PV, whether we should do upstream from the assembling to solar cell or downstream from the silica to the next process. So I think many things the government need to decide, and this need a lot of information for the government to digest and need to engage more actors, domestic, private, international, to look at the situation and be bold in developing the policy, in particular industrial policy and also fiscal related policy. And I would like to also to mention about when we attract investment, we need to dig more on the distribution of benefit of the investment, because we give a lot of incentive, tax incentive, and we give red carpet, so we don't proceed with a regular investment policy permit, and and there is a cost to that. So and if we evaluate, for nickel, for example, what local communities get from that. So we have the opportunity cost of, foregone revenue, for example, but at the local levels, we don't get made enough benefit, for example. So I think we need to look again on the phasing, also on the incentive, when we should stop, for example, and how to make sure the investment creates benefit, welfare, in particular to local communities by setting a right standard or safeguard for this ESG. But the problem in setting the standard is we have options to apply different level of standard. Yeah? And sometimes the company can be driven by markets, for example, like pushing like IRMA certification, because of the market. But we can also look for other market, that needs lower ESG safeguard. But the problem is in setting safeguard, I think the first thing the government need to do is setting the lowest barrier, So like the bottom line, what is the bottom line? This is very important. So if the company want to move beyond that, it will be good, to serve the market. But the problem is, I think we need to serve the people first before the market. So I think that's some point that I want to add.
Thank you very much, Aline. I'd like to open it up now to questions from the audience. Lights are quite bright, so I can't see further back. Okay, lady in the middle. Have we got a roving mic somewhere? Or you could shout.
Thank you so much, first of all, to the organizers of this event. This has been one of the most interesting discussions I've been to since coming to Climate Week. Wonderful information, and thank you also, Ix, for the amazing work that you are doing. I would like to ask a question about one of the capitals that I haven't heard a lot about, and Amar will know what I will mention. We've talked a lot about physical capital. We've talked a lot about natural capital. We've not talked so much about human capital. And I say that also because we often refer to Asia, and we often refer to what happened with the Asian tigers. I lived there for 10 years. What Asia did back in the day when it became so prosperous is invest in people. And that's always an issue, even when we talk about a transition, that we kind of miss. And I heard earlier, Jorge, you were saying labor market costs, it's not really the driver anymore of what will happen to the movements of capital and investments. But what is the role then of human capital? And also, there's a fourth big shift that we haven't talked about, which is demography. We talk about climate, digital, and geopolitics, but there's also huge demographic shifts happening, aging populations and then very young populations. How do we factor that into our thinking?
Thank you very much. Any other questions from Rob?
Thank you. So we've seen two panels now talk about the enormous amount of private capital that is looking for risk-adjusted returns and really willing to step in where they can find it, including in emerging markets. And then we have a lot of discussions about governments and international bodies that are really seeking, with deficits and debt the way they're really seeking that private capital to bring it together. I think we've all been to conferences over the past decade where we hear about lack of bankability and lack of investability from the same organizations. So I'd really like to say, what can we do after a decade of hearing these conversations that really catalyzes and makes a change to try and bring this forward, to get the capital where it needs to go, to get the right risk-adjusted returns From this report and from other engagements that you're seeing, is there something really transformational that can actually make it happen?
And one more from the front. Sorry, just here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, very quickly, just to take advantage of Rob's comment. I think that all these transformations that we are seeing in the world, they suggest that there is a very interesting room for what we call green corridors, being in the mineral sector, in the food sector, in the power shoring sector, and this type of thing. And that means industrial policy coordination between developing and developed economies, so that you start your whatever industrialization in a given country, let's say in Indonesia, and then you keep improving and adding value in developed economies. So that could be part of the solution for developing economies to industrialize comparative advantages in a much nicer and attractive way, including taxonomies, certifications, standards, investments, of course, trade agreements, and all these things. I think that this is extremely attractive for developed and developing economies, and even more attractive for the private sector.
Thanks very much. Any volunteers from the panel on questions on the role of human capital and demography? Yeah.
Thank you very much for raising that question. It's a wonderful question. I'm happy that there are people who are alive to this issue that human capital is, if you ask me, human capital is most important. Many countries, including India, we have focused too much on physical capital and less on human capital. Studies after studies have pointed out that you need human capital to grow faster. Actually, some countries have done it. But still, I don't know political economy of that, human capital. Maybe politicians see, they are there for, in India, the term is 5 years. They see short-term benefits in developing physical infrastructure, which is easily visible to people. You develop roads, you develop bridges, you develop airports. But spending on health and education is much more important, if you ask me, and I entirely agree with you, and that has long-term benefits. And we have also studied that part, and we find that countries which have balanced this physical capital and human capital have done much better than those which have focused only on physical capital. So absolutely there's no doubt that there's a need for putting more emphasis on human capital. It's a question of, setting your priorities right. Yeah, that's a major question. It's not that the resources are not there. If you can spend resources on subsidies, even nowadays people are spending resources on fuel subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies. Why not to spend money on human resources? So I entirely agree with you, yeah.
Thank you, Janak. And then private capital mobilization, what can we do to unlock it? You maybe, Amar?
Yeah, just to not only underscore what Janak said, but let me add one additional capital, Elizabeth, that's social capital. Okay, social capital. And the reason social capital is so important is we are looking at transformation, as Janak pointed out, that will take decades. So unless you have real deep commitment, it's not going to endure. So very important to think of institutions and social capital as the fourth dimension. So I wanted, on the private capital mobilization, so there's a kind of a good argument and there's a bad argument. So the bad argument is we don't have fiscal resources, we need private resources. The reality right now is that private capital is not only insufficient at scale, it is completely lacking in reach. It's concentrated in a few economies, and its cost is very high. So we shouldn't sort of pull out private capital everywhere and say, is the solution, because there are some public good aspects that private capital should not finance, will not finance, and we have to recognize that private capital is not a solution if the cost is too high. So there's a lot of homework that has to be done in the case of private capital. So it starts essentially with creating an ecosystem of project preparation that is linked to private finance at the start, not at the end. And the Global Infrastructure Facility, which is the kind of agglomeration amongst the MDBs, shows that it's possible to do that even in more difficult environments. We just need to scale it up. We need to improve that system. So I think that's the first part. Second, we need to focus a lot more on structured finance as a solution for producing results that's more tailor-made, right? And particularly for that, we need a lot more catalytic finance, especially catalytic equity. We know that's something. Third, we need to close the gap between actual and perceived risks in emerging markets and developing countries. The GEMS database shows that's absolutely the case, but we'll have a meeting discussion tomorrow on how we can enhance that with private sector data. So data is going to be another very important part. Securitization. A lot of the private finance is only coming from the banks, never gets securitized, never attracts long-term finance. There's movement in that space, but a lot more to be done. And the final point, which again, it's come out quite clearly, are the regulatory impediments and the regulatory support. So, Luis has been doing our work on this, but I would say on the regulatory support, the ASEAN, for example, taxonomy has been a really good force within one region to try and push towards more commonality of approach and understanding in a positive way. On the negative side, and Luis is part of an eminent persons group, we need to look at the unintended consequences of regulation in affecting cross-border flows to emerging markets and developing countries. A long list, unfortunately, no magic bullets, but one where, and in this week, we are fortunately getting a lot of attention to it.
Thanks very much, Amar. And just a shameless plug for CTEX. On three of those challenges, we're trying to tackle them. So on closing the gap between perceived and actual risks in EMDEs, we're working to stretch the usefulness of the limited data provided by the GEMS database, supplementing it with academic interpretation and expert research to see how far we can go in making this decision useful for investors. On structured finance and securitization, one of the challenges is on credit ratings and rating these structures once they're set up. So we're developing a sandbox to help bring together transaction sponsors, MDBs, DFIs, and credit rating agencies to work through some of the ratings barriers. And then, of course, on the regulatory barriers, we're doing work around Basel III and Solvency II, as well as the excellent work that Louise has been driving. Apologies for that shameless plug in the last minute or so. Other panelists, any final words on any of these questions? Janak, please.
I just want to supplement what Dr. Amar has said. When it comes to capital is fungible. Let me talk about first domestic capital. Capital sees risk, return, reward. If they find returns are favorable compared to the risk, they will invest. So that's not the problem. And you may de-risk the capital, but if overall in the economy there is saving investment gap, there will be crowding out, and that would lead to an increase in interest rate, which will then have repercussions for all sorts of projects. That's insofar as domestic capital is concerned. Insofar as foreign capital is concerned, let me tell you, it's also a question of your absorptive capacity. We did a study, and we found 9 emerging market economy study we did. We found that, forget about the current account deficit which I was talking about earlier. Even if you take monetary base expansion over and above the current account deficit, then also countries are getting business as usual more capital than they can absorb. So, capital beyond current account deficit is not a capital which you can use for real resources. It's a real resource are basically current account deficit. And capital over and above either goes to your reserves, or it goes or substitutes central bank domestic liquidity. So that's what is happening. And then there are some countries, highly indebted countries, they can't absorb capital at high interest rates. They need capital in either in terms of equity or in terms of grant, so that the quality of capital then matters. Yeah.
Thank you, Janak. Let's leave it there. Thank you so much to our panelists. Join me in applauding them. Thank you. And Marusha.
Yep. I'll just wait for them to. Thank you, Mo, and thank you again to all of our panellists. We will now hear a short reflection from civil society. Please join me in welcoming Mariana de Paula, co-founder and executive director of Instituto de Codifica.
Hello, perfect. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking the Institute for Climate Society, CETEX, LAC, SEBRI, and especially South of the Future for the invitation to take part in this important moment of reflection during London Climate Action Week. I came here to fulfill my role as member of civil society and bring this debate closer to people's realities. My name is Mariana de Paula, and I'm a co-founder and executive director from the Codifica Institute, an organization born in Jacarezinha, a favela in Rio de Janeiro, working at the intersection of data, racial justice, gender justice, and social transformation. Our work is guided by a simple principle. Communities should not only be the subjects of research or the beneficiaries of public policies. They should also participate in the production of knowledge and the decisions that affect their lives. Throughout this morning, we have heard important discussions about investment, productive competitiveness, and the opportunities that ecological transition creates for Brazil. The research launched today shows that the country has unique conditions to play a strategic role in this new global landscape. But I would like to offer a complementary reflection. For those of us who work daily in favelas, local communities, and vulnerable territories, the question is not only how much investment will be reached in Brazil, but also how will this investment be felt in the people's lives. The ecological transition is often presented as an agenda of infrastructure, technology, finance, and industry. And it's all of those things very important, but it's also an agenda about people, territories, and development. And if you are discussing development, I believe we need to broaden the notion of capital that guides this debate. We often talk about financial capital, natural capital, and productive capital. But there is another strategic asset that will be crucial for the success of the ecological transition, and it's the knowledge. Knowledge is a form of capital. It shapes decisions, reduces risks, and helps identify opportunities. Yet, not all forms of knowledge are recognized equally. For a long time, vulnerable territories and local communities have been seen mainly as places where public policies should arrive. They have rarely been recognized as places capable of producing valuable knowledge to guide those same policies. At Instituto Decodifica, we work with a methodology called citizen-generated data. Through this approach, residents produce evidence about their challenges they face and the solutions that already exist within their communities. One example is Retratos das Enchentes, in inglês is like Portraits of Floods, supported by ICS and another philanthropic organizations, and implemented in communities across Rio de Janeiro, Pernambuco, and now expanded to other Brazilian states. The finding reveals something very important. Climate impacts are not limited to material losses. They mean interruptions to work and income, children missing school, impacts on physical and mental health. They mean forced displacement in violations of rights. Very often, these dimensions do not appear in the traditional statistics that guide public policies and investment decisions. That's why, when discussing a growth strategy based on the ecological transition, we must also discuss who participates in producing the evidence that informs decision-making. What we measure shapes what we prioritize. And what we prioritize shapes who benefits from the opportunities created by the transition. I came from Bonn Climate Conference to London Climate Week, and something became very clear to me. All of these discussions, they are very essential through indicators, models, projections, and metrics. But there is a risk when adaptation and the kind of this conversation that we're having right now reserved only for experts. In the communities where we work, people do not necessarily talk about adaptation, climate justice, or ecological transition. But they are talking about the impacts of the extreme weather on their health and their lives. That's why climate action cannot be understood only through models and the projections. Science is essential, but it can be strengthened by the lived experience of the people facing climate impacts every day. We need to combine science, technology, and infrastructure, and territorial local knowledge. The research present today argues that Brazil must transform its comparative advantages into dynamic competitive advantages. I fully agree. But I also believe there is another strategic advantage that remains largely unrecognized in this kind of conversation: the capacity of Brazilian territories to produce knowledge about their own realities. If you want a truly inclusive transition, we must expand who participates in the production of evidence and the design of the solutions. In fact, I think this event itself represents the kind of collaboration we need. Universities, civil society, banks, institutions, philanthropic organizations, and other stakeholders sitting around the same table. The success of the ecological transition will not be measured only by the amount of capital mobilized. It also depends on its ability to create quality jobs, strengthen local capacities, and reduce inequalities. Perhaps Brazil's greatest contribution to the world would not simply be showing how to finance the ecological transition. Perhaps it will be demonstrating how to build a transition that is democratic, participatory, and capable of reducing historical inequalities. A transition which peripheral communities, Black and Indigenous peoples, traditional communities, social movements, universities, governments, and the private sector build solutions together for a common challenge. This is also why initiatives such as South of the Future are so important. I think they remind us that the challenges of our time require new forms of collaboration and a broader appreciation of the different forms of knowledge that exist throughout society. I would like to invite everyone here to continue this discussion at the event at the South of the Future. It will be hosting in São Paulo in August as part of São Paulo Action Climate Week. We need more space where diverse voices can imagine it, debate, and build pathways toward a just ecological transition grounding the perspectives of the Global South. I hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariana. To conclude today's event, it is my great pleasure to invite His Excellency, Ambassador Antonio Patriota, Ambassador of Brazil to the United Kingdom. Throughout a distinguished diplomatic career, Ambassador Patriota has played a leading role in shaping Brazil's international engagement on issues including sustainable development, climate diplomacy, and multilateral cooperation. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Very strong light here on top. But now let me first of all congratulate you for organizing this debate. I did not manage to hear the entire conversation, but I'm always very encouraged when I listen to highly knowledgeable people speaking about current challenges from a perspective that includes comparisons between Brazil and countries such as India and Indonesia. I think this is highly valuable for us, and it's not something that we are accustomed to. So one of the joys of being ambassador to the United Kingdom is interacting with the very high quality academic institutions in this country and in the city of London. So being present here and listening to you experts discuss the challenges before Brazil and the fact that we are all, during London Climate Action Week, concerned with ecological transition is very inspiring for me. I believe that to such a qualified audience on economic matters, on environmental matters, my role is probably to speak a little bit about foreign policy and what Brazil tries to achieve through diplomacy in a world that presents us with so many different difficulties and challenges. So speaking of this government, Lula government number 3 that began in January 2023, I think it's important to note that the world came to Brazil during the past few years. First of all, through our presidency of the G20. So it was a great opportunity, actually, for President Lula to re-engage internationally, and he did so with a measure of creativity, and I think it's fair to recognize that Brazilian diplomacy does what Mariana was just saying now, share with the world ideas that are domestically elaborated, of course, with input from elsewhere, but very much in an autonomous and independent manner. So, for example, some of the issues that were put on the agenda and some of the legacy from that meeting, I think, is still shaping debates today. You have the Global Alliance on Hunger and Poverty that is a reality under the FAO. You had a pioneer discussion on the taxation of high net worth individuals, the taxation of billionaires. When we first raised it, it seemed that it would be impossible to include that in the final document, and yet it did find its way into the final communique through a rather careful and a creative formulation as well. And of course, recognizing that this is still an initial and preliminary discussion, but one that I believe will stay with us as we observe the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a few individuals. So an opportunity, an example of Brazilian engagement with the world, and a moment of hosting so many world leaders in Brazil. This following year was very much shaped and marked by COP30, of course. So the largest conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate. Many were skeptical about our ability to host this in the Amazon region. Of course, the logistics were probably imperfect, but many of these COPs have been imperfect in the past. I think the important thing was to bring so many committed participants in a moment when the United States was disengaging from climate and withdrawing from the Climate Convention and still producing quite a significant outcome. As President of COP30, André Correia do Lago, who was here in London this week for the second time, he was last year as well, and as he has highlighted, whereas during the negotiating process you need consensus, so it's a very arduous, time-consuming, and often frustrating process to get everybody on board. Having concluded to a great extent the negotiating, the rule book since Paris, what is now key is implementation, and implementation does not require a consensus. You can actually create groups and advance in accelerated fashion and lead by example, which I think is something that Brazil is managing to do. Many of our assets and our comparative advantages are well known and were highlighted today, the comparatively clean energy mix, the self-sufficiency in energy and food production and water. And now, something we've discovered recently, we're sitting on a mountain of critical minerals, of rare earth, and other important endowments for the next phase of our development. But I would also point out that economically we've been doing comparatively well. I think it's very important to keep this comparative perspective. We will be back, according to the IMF World Bank statistics this year, among the 10 most important economies from the point of view of GDP. We have actually improved our position in the Human Development Index created by Indian economist Amartya Sen, Bengali, perhaps he would prefer to be called. And this year, for the first time, included in the high human development category. On deforestation, the results are very well known. They're quite impressive. I think President Lula's commitment from day one was clear, including through his announcement that we would host COP30 in Brazil. And now we are seeing an entirely new paradigm in combating deforestation in the Amazon. And there was a question in one of the former segments about democracy and fragility of democracy in Brazil. I think I'd like to point out that according to a institute based in Sweden, the VDEM Institute, which issues an annual ranking of democracies by several criteria, including freedom of expression, institutional strength, etc. Brazil, for the first time, is placed ahead of the United Kingdom this year, which is quite surprising. Number 28 out of 190 countries. United Kingdom is number 30. The United States, number 51. And the position different countries occupy is significant, but also the trend. So there's a little arrow that goes up or down, depending on your position. In the case of Brazil, it's going up. There is confidence on the part of this institute at least, and if it's Sweden, you know, people tend to take it very seriously. Positive trend in Brazil, not so positive when it comes to the United States, for example. So in an environment of polarization and erosion of democratic rule in many parts of the world, I think Brazil is managing to preserve its institutions and to some degree make progress. The last intervention reminded me that, of course, human capital, I think, is a fundamental aspect of the conversation. Through our interaction with the multilateral system, Brazil has kind of mainstreamed into our national policy several concepts that are now universally accepted, but the idea of sustainability itself did not come about spontaneously. It was a product of decades of multilateral conversation. Rio 92 was a landmark, Rio plus 20, kind of, in the eyes of some, replaced the Washington consensus with a new consensus in which economic growth in and of itself would not be a paradigm for improving livelihood of the majority of the population, especially in the developing world. And so the environmental and social variable came into the equation. And this has been incorporated, I think, with conviction and enthusiasm in Brazilian national policy, but also in Brazilian foreign policy. And when I think of the challenges ahead in Brazil for reducing inequality and improving the livelihood of segments of the population that have been historically at a disadvantage, I think it's important to note that today Brazil has 4 ministries that deal with human rights. So there's an overall human rights ministry, there is a ministry for gender equality, there is a ministry to combat racial discrimination, promote racial equality, and for the first time in our history, there is a ministry for the indigenous people, a community that has been growing in Brazil at higher rates than the rest of the population. Today, more than 1 million Brazilians identify as indigenous, and this is a pioneer experiment, still struggling to find its place within the national bureaucracy, but headed by indigenous people themselves. And the first minister was a female, and she is now running for office, so a substitute. These are some highlights that I think help to position Brazil in a strong place when it comes to defending a more just world. I often speak of our intergenerational responsibility because the entire environmental agenda brings that to the foreground, what kind of legacy we would like to present to the incoming generations, to our children and grandchildren. And I think in this respect, again, Brazil has quite a bit to offer because not only have we embraced the notion that economic development and environmental responsibility, social progress need to advance in tandem, but we have also, very strong advocates for the Pacific resolution of conflict. So I think we're one of the few countries today that really denounce the arms race that is going on, you know, the deviation of valuable material resources into military budgets that create the illusion of security, but actually, I think in many situations, only encourage rivalry, competition, and have very questionable results from a security perspective. And this was not mentioned, but I think it's one of the big differences between Brazil and India, for example. We have no enemies. We have diplomatic relations with every single UN member. Today, we are among the 10 countries in the world with the largest number of embassies and consulates. This is something that perhaps only diplomats keep a tally of, but that is quite significant from a Brazilian perspective because it's a recent development. It's a 21st century development, actually, this global outreach and this very strong diplomatic presence around the world, not to mention very active participation in the multilateral organizations. Very different situation from India where there is belligerence with neighbors and our military budget is about 1/4, 25% of what the Indian is. India's military budget today is number 5 in the world and growing. I was just reading recently that it grew by more than 10% last year. So there is this stability or peace premium that I think also is a defining trait of Brazil's profile internationally, and that we also view as part of our intergenerational responsibility. I think it's an obligation for political leaders and diplomats to strive to promote a more peaceful world, not to increase international tension, not to exacerbate rivalry, whether at the regional or a global level. But let me also mention, perhaps as a final thought, a word about Brazil-UK relations, but also recognize that trade-wise, we have been performing in a not only competitive manner, but also with a very Brazilian characteristic, which is not placing too many eggs in a single basket. So a good distribution of trading partners and some achievements that deserve to be highlighted. The fact that the Mercosur-European Union Free Trade Agreement just came into force after 25 years of very arduous interaction. Another free trade agreement with European countries, the Mercosur-EFTA Free Trade Agreement, having come into force last year. And we are hopeful that we will soon be announcing a Mercosur-United Kingdom Free Trade Agreement. This has been on the agenda more or less since my arrival here in London. At first, it took some time to get off the ground. But I think indirectly, as British authorities realize that the entire European continent has a free trade relationship with Brazil, and they are the only outlying country, this acts as an indirect incentive. So I'm quite optimistic that we will advance relatively quickly next year. On the Mercosur side, there's a consensus that this is a desirable process. So important also for our relationship with Argentina, because although there are many areas, in addition to football, where we don't completely align with our southern neighbor, on trade, there is good understanding, and especially on this. I mean, I could also highlight the fact that the trade surpluses have been quite significant. We are in a unique position of having a huge trade surplus with China, for example. When I mention this here to British audiences, it usually raises eyebrows because it's very much counterintuitive from a European perspective, and not excessive dependency on any single market. Still, I think we can derive greater benefits from trade, generally speaking. When you think that Brazil and the UK will be, well, we are now 10th economy in the world, the UK 5th or 6th, depending on the ranking. And yet we are number 26 in terms of our trade relationships, so quite a bit of room for improvement. But otherwise, we have recently signed, as recently as March of this year, a declaration on the enhancement of our strategic partnership with a specific program for the next 5 years until 2030. This involves new mechanisms that will enhance political dialogue. For the first time, we will have a dialogue specifically geared towards multilateral affairs. So trade, finance, technology, the environment. The environment has been an anchor for the bilateral relationship, I have to say. And in this respect, I think we must recognize the role that the monarchy in the UK plays. King Charles and Prince William are enthusiasts. They have been extremely supportive of the bilateral agenda. Prince William came to COP30 and announced his Earthshot Prize in Rio last year, and he has been a very strong supporter of an initiative you're probably familiar with, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, the TFFF. That is an innovative mechanism that's announced in Belém last year for protecting tropical forests around the world, not only the Amazon, but in Africa, Indonesia, elsewhere. And that cuts across existing donor-recipient paradigm and dynamics by enlisting significant financial resources from the Global South. So Brazil and Indonesia having already pledged to contribute $1 billion each. In so doing, also attracting significant contribution from the likes of Norway, Germany, France, and others. We are hopeful that the UK will soon be announcing as well. So as we celebrate the bicentennial of Brazil-UK relations, I think there's quite a bit going on. It is on a positive track. There are areas where we can deepen the understanding, and I think we can certainly work together for overcoming some of the, I would even say, nastier sides of the North-South dynamics that we still observe in many, many international instances, not least of which environmental negotiations. I think we really need to kind of realize that there are unilateralist threats, as I sometimes call them, and in order to use a relatively neutral word and not to name any country. And there are all those of us who would like to not only preserve respect for international law and cooperation under mutually beneficial terms and agreements, resisting protectionism, and certainly resisting the dismantling of organizations that we have arduously built, such as WTO, the United Nations, et cetera. And in this endeavor to protect what we have, to advance in new directions, such as artificial intelligence, the new technologies, et cetera, we really need to work together, all of us. So we can't afford the luxury of continuing with a north-south dynamics that only produces sterile outcomes. And in so doing, I would even differ slightly from the Prime Minister of Canada, who spoke about a coalition of middle powers. It's very difficult to understand what exactly a middle power is. There's no definition. I think you need every single multilateralist actor on board. Government, civil society, academia, personalities, and very small countries sometimes play a very significant role. Look at Vanuatu in reaching out to the International Court of Justice. Look at Barbados, Mia Mottley, and creating the Bridgetown Initiative. And maybe the most extreme example, look at the Vatican. You know, it is a state, an observer state member of the United Nations, and also playing a very important role, fulfilling a role in providing moral, ethical leadership at a time of a certain vacuum in this regard when it comes to artificial intelligence and other recent technological developments. So thank you for your attention. Congratulations for organizing this debate, and I hope to remain engaged with all of you. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you for those thoughtful reflections. That concludes today's event. On behalf of CTEX, ICS and SEBRI, thank you all for joining us and contributing to this discussion. We hope today's conversation has helped advance thinking on how investment, development and the ecological transition can reinforce one another in Brazil and beyond. We'd like to invite you to network. They have refreshed the refreshments, so please, everyone, stay hydrated. Thank you again, and we wish you an excellent rest of London Climate Action Week.